Something strange happened in the 1990s. Video games were exploding in popularity, but their animated adaptations kept disappearing. Some were too ambitious, some misunderstood their source, others simply arrived at the wrong time. Hidden beneath the giants are 20 rare cartoons that tried to turn gameplay into story. What they created was unpredictable. What they left behind is even more fascinating. And once you see them, you will never look at game adaptations the same way again. Number 20. Sakura Wars, 1997. There is something quietly strange about how a tactical strategy game about theater performers turned into one of the most elegant anime adaptations of the late 90s. Sakura Wars did not explode into global fame. It moved differently. It built its world slowly. It trusted atmosphere over noise. Set in a steampunk version of Tokyo, the story follows Sakura Shinguji, who joins an all-female combat troupe that doubles as stage performers. These women are not just entertainers. They pilot steam-powered mechs to defend the city from supernatural threats. That concept alone sounds chaotic, but the anime treats it with discipline and emotional restraint. What makes this adaptation rare is how seriously it respects its source. The Sega Saturn game relied heavily on character relationships and timed dialogue choices. The anime mirrors that structure through quiet interactions and tension that builds beneath polite conversation. There are no rushed arcs. Every moment lingers, and yet most Western audiences never saw it during its time. It remained locked behind regional distribution and niche fandom. That isolation turned it into something almost mythical. Because this was not just a game adaptation, it was proof that video game stories could carry emotional weight without shouting. And as this countdown unfolds, you will notice something unsettling. Many of the most ambitious adaptations were also the ones that disappeared first. Number 19. Tekken the Motion Picture, 1998. At first glance, Tekken looks like the least adaptable story imaginable. A fighting game built on tournaments and rivalries. Minimal dialogue, maximum impact. But the 1998 animated film attempted something bold. It tried to give meaning to the punches. The story centers on Kazuya Mishima and his brutal relationship with his father, Heihachi. That dynamic already existed in the games, but here it becomes the emotional spine. The film leans into betrayal, control, generational violence. It transforms a tournament into a psychological battlefield. What makes this adaptation fascinating is how it fills in the silence of the games. Characters who once existed only as fighters suddenly have motives. Fear becomes visible. Loyalty becomes fragile. Even the tournament feels less like spectacle and more like manipulation. Yet despite this effort, it never reached mainstream audiences in the way the games did. Distribution was limited, marketing was quiet, and the result was predictable. It faded. But here is the detail most viewers miss. This was one of the earliest attempts to treat a fighting game as narrative cinema rather than visual chaos. It was ahead of its time. And that pattern will repeat again and again, the more ambitious the adaptation, of the faster it vanished. Number 18. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, 1997. In the late 90s, Capcom's Cadillacs and Dinosaurs stood out as one of the most unusual arcade concepts ever created. A mix of post-apocalyptic survival, high-speed vehicle combat, and prehistoric chaos, it eventually crossed into animation through a short-lived television adaptation. The story is set in a future where humanity has returned to a ruined Earth, and dinosaurs have mysteriously re-emerged. Society is fractured between those trying to preserve nature and those exploiting it for power and control. Jack Tenrec, the central protagonist, operates in this unstable world as part mechanic, part fighter, navigating conflicts between human factions and rogue hunters. The animated adaptation leans heavily into adventure storytelling. While the original arcade game focused on side-scrolling combat and action-heavy progression, the show expands the world into episodic missions involving dinosaur encounters, environmental collapse, and human corruption. What makes this adaptation stand out is its tonal ambition. It blends action with ecological themes and survival storytelling, creating a setting that feels larger than its gameplay origins. Dinosaurs are not just enemies. They are part of a shifting ecosystem that constantly influences human survival. However, despite its creative premise, the series struggled to maintain visibility. Limited distribution and niche source material kept it from reaching mainstream audiences, and it quickly faded from broadcast memory. Still, it remains a fascinating example of how even the most unconventional arcade games were briefly reimagined as full narrative worlds during the experimental phase of 1990s animation. Number 17. Battletech: The Animated Series, 1994. At first glance, Battletech feels like it belongs more to science fiction cinema than video game adaptation. Massive war machines, political factions, a universe built on long-standing conflict rather than arcade-style gameplay. Yet its animated series quietly emerged in the mid-90s as part of the growing wave of game-based storytelling. Unlike many adaptations that simplify their source, Battletech does the opposite. It expands it. The story follows a group of mercenary pilots operating massive mechanized units known as battlemechs, navigating a fractured galaxy shaped by war, betrayal, and shifting alliances. The tone is unusually grounded for its time. Combat is not just action-driven spectacle. It is tactical, deliberate, and often exhausting. Pilots are not invincible heroes. They are professionals surviving in a system that rarely rewards loyalty. What makes this series interesting is its refusal to soften its identity. There is no attempt to turn it into a light adventure cartoon. Instead, it leans into military structure and serialized conflict. Every episode feels like part of a larger campaign rather than a standalone story. But that seriousness also worked against it. It lacked the accessibility of more mainstream adaptations. Viewers unfamiliar with the universe found it dense. Those expecting fast-paced action found it restrained, so it slipped through the cracks. Yet, in hindsight, it represents something important, a rare example of a game-based universe trying to preserve its complexity instead of simplifying it for television. And in that attempt, it quietly predicted the direction many adaptations would eventually take decades later. Number 16. Pac-Man, 1993. Pac-Man should have been the easiest adaptation on this list, a character recognized across the world. A simple concept, endless potential for expansion. And yet the 1993 revival chose a strange path. It tried to turn simplicity into structure. Instead of endless maze chasing the show, builds a full world called Pac-Land. Characters have roles, families exist, society functions. Ghosts are no longer just obstacles. They become personalities with motives and humor. The shift is dramatic. What makes this version rare is how disconnected it feels from what audiences expected. The arcade game was immediate, fast, addictive. The cartoon slows everything down and replaces tension with narrative. It becomes a traditional children's series rather than an extension of gameplay. That decision confused viewers. It removed the urgency that defined the original experience. Without that pressure, the identity starts to blur. The result is a show that feels familiar yet strangely distant. And because of that, it faded quickly. Not because it failed completely, but because it misunderstood what made the source powerful. Number 15. Wild West COW Boys of Moo Mesa, 1992. This is where things start to feel surreal. A Western-themed cartoon about cowboys who are literally cows sounds like a toy line creation. But beneath that strange surface sits a real video game origin, a Konami arcade shooter that most players barely remember. The adaptation takes that loose concept and expands it into a full frontier world. Lawmen, outlaws, dusty towns, classic Western structure, but filtered through exaggerated animation and animal characters. What makes Moo Mesa unusual is how confidently it builds a setting from almost nothing. The original game provided action, but very little narrative. The cartoon fills that gap completely. It invents relationships, conflicts, even moral codes. And yet that freedom becomes its weakness. Without strong ties to recognizable gameplay, the show struggles to maintain identity. It feels like a Western first and a game adaptation second. That disconnect makes it easy to forget where it came from. Still, there is something impressive here. It proves that even the most minimal game concepts can be expanded into full worlds. And the problem is not creativity. The problem is recognition. Number 14. Dragon's Lair, 1993. Before modern cinematic games existed, Dragon's Lair was already experimenting with animation-driven gameplay. It looked like a cartoon. It played like a challenge. Every move mattered. Every mistake punished instantly. The 1993 animated series tries to reverse that formula. Instead of gameplay driving the animation now drives the story. Dirk the Daring becomes a full character rather than a sequence of actions. Princess Daphne gains personality. The world expands beyond quick decisions. At first, this seems like the perfect transition, but something unexpected happens. Without the constant tension of player input, the story loses its edge. The danger feels softer. The urgency fades. What made Dragon's Lair special was not just its visuals, it was the pressure. The feeling that failure was always seconds away. The cartoon cannot replicate that sensation. It replaces interaction with observation. And that change is subtle but powerful. It transforms a thrilling experience into a standard fantasy narrative. Still, the attempt matters. It represents one of the earliest efforts to translate cinematic gameplay into traditional storytelling. And even though it did not fully succeed, it opened a door. Number 13. Bubsy, 1993. Pilot. Sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones that never become shows. Bubsy is one of those cases, a character designed to compete with platforming mascots of the early 90s. Fast-talking, overconfident, built entirely on attitude. So the pilot attempts to turn that personality into a full narrative. Bubsy talks constantly. Jokes come rapidly. The tone is loud and chaotic. It tries to capture the energy of the games, but push it even further. And that is where it collapses. What works in short bursts during gameplay becomes exhausting over time. The character has no restraint, no contrast, no quiet moments to balance the noise. Without that balance, the humor begins to wear thin quickly. Networks saw the problem immediately. The pilot never moved forward. It was shelved and slowly forgotten. But that failure is important because it exposes a core truth about adaptations. Not every game mechanic translates into storytelling. Speed does not equal depth. Noise does not equal engagement. Bubsy was designed to grab attention, but attention alone is not enough to sustain a world. Number 12. Battletoads, 1992. Pilot. Battletoads was never subtle. The game was aggressive, fast, brutal in its difficulty. It demanded precision and punished failure without mercy. Translating that into a cartoon required a delicate balance. The pilot chose not to balance at all. Instead, it leans fully into exaggeration. The toads are loud, confident, almost reckless in tone. Action dominates every moment. Dialogue exists mainly to bridge one explosive sequence to the next. It feels like the game brought to life without hesitation. And that is exactly the problem. What works as an adrenaline rush in gameplay becomes overwhelming when stretched into narrative form. There is little room to breathe, no emotional grounding, no real stakes beyond constant chaos. The energy never drops, and because of that, it loses impact. The pilot never moved forward into a full series. It remained a one-off attempt that quietly disappeared. But its failure reveals something critical. Faithfulness alone is not enough. Capturing the tone of a game is only the first step. Sustaining it requires control. Battletoads refused to slow down, and in doing so, it burned itself out before it could even begin. But not every adaptation failed because it was too intense. Some failed for the opposite reason. They softened their edges so much that the original identity almost vanished. Number 11. Earthworm Jim, 1995. Earthworm Jim was never meant to make sense. The game thrived on absurdity, random humor, characters that felt like they were invented seconds before appearing on screen. It was chaos by design, and surprisingly, the cartoon understands that. Instead of forcing structure onto the madness, it embraces it. The narrative bends, logic stretches, characters behave unpredictably. But beneath that chaos, there is control. The show knows exactly how far to push before pulling back. Jim himself becomes more than a joke. He carries a strange sincerity, a hero who does not fully understand his own world, yet keeps moving forward anyway. That contrast gives the series weight. What makes this adaptation rare is how well it preserves identity without losing accessibility. It remains weird, but never alienating. Funny, but never exhausting. That balance is difficult, and few shows manage it. So why did it not dominate the decade? Because it arrived in a crowded landscape, competing against larger franchises with stronger marketing. It did not fail. It simply could not break through. And that is a different kind of disappearance. Not sudden, not dramatic, just gradual fading. Number 10. Donkey Kong Country, 1997. This is where the countdown becomes impossible to ignore. Donkey Kong Country was already a massive success on the Super Nintendo. The leap to animation should have been effortless. Instead, it became one of the strangest experiments of the decade. The series uses early CGI, not polished, not refined. It feels rigid, almost artificial. Characters move in ways that feel slightly off. Expressions land a fraction too late. The world looks familiar, yet distant at the same time. And yet, there is something captivating about it. The show commits fully to its style. It builds a musical tone. Characters sing, stories unfold with unexpected rhythm. It refuses to play safe even when the technology struggles to keep up. What makes this adaptation memorable is not perfection. It is ambition. It tries to push beyond traditional animation at a time when the tools were not ready. That risk creates a strange effect. Viewers remember it not because it was flawless, but because it felt different, uncomfortable at times, but impossible to ignore. And that discomfort lingers. Because as we move forward, the gap between success and obscurity becomes thinner. Some shows stood right at the edge of mainstream recognition. Number 9. Pokémon, 1997. Everything changes here. Pokémon did not just succeed, it redefined what a video game adaptation could become. What started as a Game Boy experiment transformed into a global phenomenon that reshaped television itself. The structure is simple. A young trainer travels the world capturing creatures and competing in battles. But beneath that simplicity lies something deeper. Growth, friendship, persistence, loss. The show builds emotional continuity in a way few adaptations had attempted before. What makes Pokémon powerful is consistency. It does not rush. It allows characters to evolve slowly. Relationships develop over time. Victories feel earned. Failures feel real. And unlike many entries on this list, it reached everywhere. It was not hidden, not obscure. It became unavoidable. So why include it here? Because its early seasons still belong to this era. And more importantly, it highlights the contrast. For every Pokémon, there were dozens of shows that never reached that level. Shows that tried, failed, and disappeared. Pokémon is not just part of this story. It is the exception that proves the rule. Because as we continue the countdown, the focus shifts back to those forgotten attempts, the ones that came close but never quite broke through. Number 8. Wing Commander Academy, 1996. By the mid-90s, video games were beginning to chase cinematic storytelling. Few titles embraced that shift more than Wing Commander. Full-motion video, expanding lore, a universe built on war and consequence. The animated series attempts to carry that weight forward. Instead of simplifying the world, it leans into it. Military structure defines everything. Characters are not just heroes. They are cadets under pressure. Training is brutal. Mistakes have consequences. The threat of the Kilrathi Empire hangs over every decision. What makes this adaptation stand out is its tone. It refuses to treat its audience as passive viewers. It demands attention. Strategy matters. Relationships evolve through conflict rather than convenience. And yet it struggled. The pacing was slower than typical action cartoons. The themes were heavier. It did not provide instant gratification. For younger audiences, it felt distant. For older audiences, it was easy to miss entirely. So it slipped away. But look closer and something becomes clear. This series was not trying to be a cartoon. It was trying to be a continuation of the game's universe. That ambition placed it in an uncomfortable space between formats, too serious for one audience, too hidden for another. Number 7. Mortal Kombat Defenders of the Realm, 1996. Mortal Kombat built its reputation on shock, violence, controversy. It was raw and unapologetic. Turning that into a children-friendly animated series required compromise, a lot of it. The result is Defenders of the Realm, a version of Mortal Kombat that removes its most defining trait. The brutality is gone. Fatalities are replaced with safe action. The tone shifts from dangerous to controlled. At first, this seems like a betrayal of the source, but something interesting happens. Without the violence, the focus moves to characters. Liu Kang becomes a true leader. Sonya Blade carries emotional weight. Even the villains gain presence beyond spectacle. The show finds a different identity, not as a shock-driven experience, but as a structured team narrative. Still, the shadow of the original games never disappears. Fans expected intensity. What they received felt restrained. That gap created distance. The series could not fully satisfy either audience, and so it faded. But its existence reveals something important. Adapting a game is not just about recreating what exists. It is about choosing what to keep and what to leave behind. Make the wrong choice, and the entire foundation shifts. Number 6. Mega Man, 1994. Mega Man should have been unstoppable. A clear premise, a recognizable hero, a villain with endless potential. The cartoon had everything it needed to succeed, and in many ways, it did. The series follows Mega Man as he battles Dr. Wily and his robotic creations. Each episode builds on the formula established by the games: new enemies, new challenges. A steady rhythm that feels familiar. What makes this adaptation effective is its clarity. It understands its structure and never tries to overcomplicate it. Action drives the story. Conflict remains focused. The world expands without losing direction. But there is a limit to that approach. Over time, repetition begins to settle in. Episodes follow predictable patterns. Surprises become rare. Without evolution, the momentum slows. Viewers begin to drift. It does not collapse. It simply plateaus. And that plateau is enough to prevent it from reaching the next level. It remains remembered but not celebrated in the way it could have been, because consistency alone is not enough. Growth matters. Number 5. Darkstalkers, 1995. Darkstalkers arrives with one of the most distinct identities on this list. Gothic creatures, dark fantasy, a tone that feels closer to horror than traditional action. The game embraced that atmosphere completely. The cartoon does not. Instead, it softens everything. Characters remain visually recognizable, but their edges are dulled. The danger fades. The darkness becomes decoration rather than substance. What was once intense becomes approachable. This creates a strange disconnect. The world looks dangerous but rarely feels that way. Stakes appear high but resolve quickly. The tension never fully develops. And yet there is still something compelling here. The characters themselves carry strong designs and personalities. Even within a softened world, they stand out. Morrigan, Dimitri, each retains enough presence to leave an impression, but that impression is incomplete because the adaptation hesitates. It does not fully commit to either direction, not fully dark, not fully light, caught in between, and that middle ground is difficult to sustain. Number 4. Street Fighter, 1995. Street Fighter entered the 90s as a global force. Arcades were filled with it. Characters became icons. Rivalries turned into legends. The animated series had a clear mission: capture that energy and translate it into story. But instead of focusing on Ryu, the show shifts toward guile. A military structure replaces wandering martial arts philosophy. Missions take priority over personal journeys. The tone becomes more tactical than spiritual. At first, this feels like a departure, but it also gives the series direction. Each episode builds around operations and objectives. Characters move with purpose. The world feels organized rather than abstract. What makes this adaptation interesting is how it reinterprets the source instead of copying it. It does not try to recreate arcade matches. It builds a narrative framework around them. Still, something is missing. The soul of Street Fighter lies in personal growth, discipline, inner conflict. Those elements exist here but remain secondary. Action dominates. Reflection takes a back seat. That imbalance keeps it from reaching its full potential. It succeeds, it entertains, but it never becomes definitive. Because the closer we get to number 1, the clearer it becomes. The best adaptations are not the loudest. They are the ones that understand what truly matters beneath the surface. And the next entry proves that even the strongest concepts can struggle to be seen. Number 3. Double Dragon, 1993. Double Dragon was built on simplicity. 2 brothers fighting their way through waves of enemies. Pure action, no distractions. Turning that into a narrative required expansion. The cartoon introduces a dystopian setting, a city divided, power structures controlling the weak. The Lee brothers become symbols rather than just fighters. Their struggle represents something larger. This shift adds weight. It gives context to the action. Battles feel connected to a bigger world rather than isolated encounters. The story gains purpose, but with that purpose comes complexity. The tone becomes darker than expected. Themes of control and resistance begin to surface. It moves away from straightforward entertainment into something more layered. That change makes it harder to categorize. And when a show becomes difficult to define, it becomes difficult to market. Viewers who expected simple action found something heavier. Those looking for deeper storytelling often missed it entirely. It existed between audiences, and so it faded into that space. Yet there is something undeniably strong here, a willingness to evolve beyond the source, to take a basic concept and push it further. Because by now, one truth is undeniable. The closer a show gets to redefining its identity, the more fragile its survival becomes. And the next entry stands as one of the strangest transformations on this entire list. Number 2. The Legend of Zelda, 1989. This should have been legendary. The Legend of Zelda carried mystery, adventure, a world filled with danger and discovery. The games built atmosphere through silence and exploration. The cartoon takes a completely different approach. It becomes loud. Link talks constantly. Humor replaces tension. Dialogue replaces mystery. The tone shifts toward light entertainment rather than epic journey. It feels almost like a parody of its own source. And yet it remains unforgettable, not because it captured the essence of Zelda, but because it chose not to. It carved its own identity even at the cost of accuracy. That decision makes it stand out in a way few adaptations do. Some viewers rejected it immediately. Others embraced its energy. But no one forgot it, and that is its strange success. It proves that faithfulness is not the only path. Sometimes deviation creates its own kind of legacy. But as we reach the final position, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when an adaptation attempts to unify everything? Multiple worlds, multiple characters, one narrative. The answer sits at number 1. Number 1, Captain N, The Game Master, 1989. This is where everything converges. Captain N does not adapt a single game. It attempts to merge entire universes. Mega Man, Castlevania, Kid Icarus, characters pulled from different worlds forced into one shared space. That ambition is staggering. The show builds a central hero from the real world who is transported into the game universe. He becomes the bridge between player and world, a living representation of the audience itself. What makes this concept powerful is its scale. It turns individual games into parts of a larger system, a connected reality where everything interacts. But with that scale comes instability. Characters are reinterpreted, designs change, personalities shift. Not everything aligns with the original games. That creates friction. Fans notice the differences immediately, and yet the idea remains compelling, because beneath the inconsistencies lies something visionary, the concept of a shared universe long before it became standard, a crossover structure that modern media now relies on constantly. Captain N was not perfect, far from it, but it was bold, and sometimes bold ideas survive longer than perfect ones. These were not just forgotten cartoons, they were experiments. Some failed quietly, some changed everything, but all of them reveal how difficult it is to turn games into stories. If one of these surprised you, then you already understand. The rarest adaptations are not the worst. They are the ones that dared to try.